Hello, and welcome back. Before we talk about the tennis, I want you to begin somewhere else entirely. Woodside, Queens. Picture 69th Street early on a Sunday morning. Bakery lights are glowing. Warm pandazol is being prepared for the first customers of the day. The elevated tracks of the 7 train rattle overhead as the train moves toward the East River, then onward toward Flushing. On an ordinary Sunday, that train might carry commuters, families, tourists, and children heading toward a baseball game. But on August 24th, 2025, it carried something different. It carried Filipino families, Filipino-American teenagers, nurses finishing overnight shifts, grandparents, friends, and first-time tennis spectators traveling toward the Billie Jean King National Tennis Center. They were going to watch a Filipino player walk onto a U.S. Open court. Her name is Alexandra Eala. She was 20 years old. She was unseeded. She was facing a seeded opponent. And for most people watching the tournament, the obvious question was simple. Could she win? But that is not the most interesting question. The more important question is this. Why were so many people who had never attended a tennis match suddenly boarding the same train to watch her? That question tells us more than the final score. It tells us something about Alex Eala, something about the Filipino diaspora, and something about the future of Philippine tennis. The easy version of this story is a resume story. Alex Eala trained at the Rafa Nadal Academy. She defeated major opponents in Miami. She reached a historic final in Eastbourne. She became the first Filipina to achieve milestones that no Filipino woman had reached before her. All of that is important. All of it is true to the larger story of her rise. But the resume explanation is also incomplete. It treats the crowd as a product of the career. The player wins, the fans appear, and the fans eventually travel. Cause and effect seem neat and predictable. Yet when you look closely at the people moving through Queens that morning, a different picture emerges. You see grandmothers who could not name a single WTA tournament before this year. You see Filipino-American nurses coming directly from overnight shifts, still wearing scrubs beneath Philippine flag jerseys. You see teenagers born in New Jersey whose parents or grandparents came from the Philippines. You see families who did not grow up watching tennis, but understood immediately what this moment meant. These were not simply tennis fans who discovered Alex Eala. They were Filipino-Americans who were already here. And something about Alex gave them a reason to gather in the same place, at the same time, around the same person. That is a very different phenomenon from an ordinary fan base. It is not only about sport, it is about identity, recognition, and the sudden appearance of a shared moment. So before we go further, if you enjoy stories about the meaning beneath the scoreline, the culture, the people, and the history surrounding the match, subscribe to the channel. Here, we take our time and look at the complete picture. Now let's establish who Alex Eala was on paper before that US Open debut. She was a young Filipina professional who began training internationally as a teenager and developed at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Spain. In 2025, she made a major breakthrough at the Miami Open. Entering the tournament ranked outside the elite group, she defeated top-level opposition and became the first Filipina to reach a WTA 1000 singles semifinal. Then, during the grass court season, she reached the final at Eastbourne. She ultimately lost a dramatic match, but the achievement was historic. She became the first Filipina to reach a WTA Tour singles final. Those results gave her credibility. They showed that she could compete with established players. They proved that she was not merely a promising junior or an inspiring national story. She was becoming a serious professional on the international stage. But even after those achievements, the crowd at the US Open still seems larger than the resume alone can explain. That is where the puzzle begins. The first piece is simple. Before that Sunday, Alex Eala had never played a US Open main draw match. Not once. She had no previous Flushing Meadows victory, no established history at the tournament, and no years of New York appearances to build from. And yet, throughout the season, cameras had repeatedly found Filipino supporters in the stands, at tournaments in Miami, on the grass courts of Eastbourne, at Wimbledon, and during the North American hard court swing, there were Philippine flags, handmade signs, and fans cheering in Tagalog and English. Most players do not develop that kind of visible international support before making their first Grand Slam breakthrough. So the question is, how does a player build a recognizable traveling audience before her first US Open main draw match? Hold that question. The second piece is her seeding, or rather, the absence of it. Alex was unseeded in New York. Under normal tournament logic, an unseeded first-round player is more likely to appear on an outer court in front of a modest crowd, without the attention reserved for the biggest names. But community groups in New York and New Jersey were reportedly discussing meetups and group travel before the match. Fans were organizing transportation. Supporters were making plans independently of the court assignment. That is not the behavior of a crowd that simply reacts to a convenient television slot. It is the behavior of a community that has already decided the player matters. So the second question becomes, why would an unseeded player command this kind of mobilization before the match even begins? The third piece is her recent form. Alex had already produced historic results, but her season was not a perfect upward line. At Cincinnati shortly before the US Open, she showed the ability to challenge a dangerous opponent and put herself in position for a major win. But she was unable to close the match and allowed the momentum to disappear. That is the reality of professional tennis. A player can look brilliant for an hour, then face the difficult problem of finishing. A promising season can contain both breakthrough victories and painful collapses. If fans were simply following wins, they would wait for a more certain moment. They would travel for a coronation, a title, a semifinal, or a guaranteed star appearance. But these supporters were showing up for uncertainty. That creates the sharpest question of all. If they were not gathering only for a victory, what exactly were they gathering for? We now have three apparent contradictions. There was a recognizable fan base before the first US Open main draw match. There was pre-match mobilization for an unseeded player, and there was a crowd willing to appear even though her recent results included both spectacular highs and difficult setbacks. When three facts are individually believable but collectively do not fit the usual explanation, that is often a sign that the frame is wrong. The frame we are used to is straightforward. A player builds a career. The career creates attention. Attention creates fans. Fans eventually gather in large numbers. In that model, the crowd is downstream from the career. But what if Alex Eala's crowd was not downstream from her career? What if the community was already there, geographically, culturally, and generationally, and Alex was the first athlete visible enough to bring that community together in one public place? Once you flip the frame, the contradictions begin to disappear. Alex did not create a Filipino-American audience from nothing. She made an existing community visible to itself. That is the reframe. The New York metropolitan area contains a large Filipino-American population, with deep roots in Queens, New Jersey, and communities across the wider region. Filipino-Americans have built families, careers, businesses, and institutions in the United States over multiple generations. Nationally, the Filipino-American population numbers in the millions. That is not a fan base one tennis player could build in a few months. It is a community that existed long before Alex entered the professional tour. It includes nurses working overnight shifts, teachers, engineers, home health aides, restaurant workers, business owners, students, and families whose American lives began in different decades, but whose cultural connections remain strong. What they did not have was a scheduled hour in a major American sports venue to gather around one of their own. Alex provided that hour. She was not necessarily the cause of the community, she became the permission slip for the community to assemble. The train was already full of people with shared histories. Alex simply gave them a stop at which they could all get off. That is why the mathematics matter, even though mathematics cannot capture the emotion of the moment. For decades, the Filipino diaspora in the United States had produced fans, families, and athletes, but no Filipino player had represented the country in a US Open main draw during the Open era before Alex Eala. That means the demand existed before the supply. For years, millions of people had a reason to care about representation, but no single player had yet reached that stage of the sport. Then, on that Sunday in New York, the gap closed. The supply became one. When decades of waiting meet one visible opportunity, an enormous response is not surprising. In fact, the surprising thing would be if no one came. The second proof comes from the way Alex herself talks about her supporters. She does not always describe them as customers, followers, or even simply fans. In interviews and post-match comments, she has often spoken about Filipino supporters as people who make her feel at home. One important word in Filipino culture is kabayan, meaning a fellow countryman or someone from the same homeland. It carries a sense of shared origin and belonging. It is different from the language of a commercial fan base. A fan base is something a player can imagine building through results. Kabayan describes a relationship that exists before the match and beyond the ranking. When Alex thanks her countrymen, she is recognizing more than the noise they create in the stands. She is acknowledging a shared identity. And when she says, Filipino supporters make her feel at home, she is not speaking as if she manufactured that community. She is speaking as if she found her people, and they found her. That is the reframe expressed in one word. The third proof is the day itself. If the crowd is only a product of results, then the meaning of the day depends entirely on the score. A victory produces celebration. A loss produces disappointment. The emotional value of the event rises and falls with the scoreboard. But if the crowd represents a community seeing itself in a major public moment, the day is already historic before the first serve. For the first time, Filipino Americans in Queens, Jersey City, Bergen County, California, and communities across the country could watch the same Filipina player walk onto a U.S. Open court under the New York lights. Families watching from Manila, Cebu, or elsewhere in the Philippines could share that moment with relatives in the United States. Someone could be watching from a hospital break room. Someone else could be watching from a living room surrounded by grandparents and children. Another supporter could be standing among thousands of people in the stadium holding a Philippine flag. The power of the moment was simultaneity. A diaspora scattered across generations, cities, states, and time zones could briefly be in the same room about the same person. That is what makes someone who has never watched tennis before board the 7 train. Not the guarantee of a win. The possibility of finally being represented in the same frame. That is why the emotional climax is not necessarily the final set or the last point. It may be the tunnel walk. It may be the first camera shot of the crowd. It may be the moment before the first serve, when the flags are already visible and the players realize the atmosphere is different. No scoreline can take that moment away. Now, there are important limits to this argument. The reframe does not prove that Alex Eala will win every match. It does not guarantee a second-round victory, a Grand Slam title, or a permanent place in the top tier of the sport. Professional tennis remains brutally difficult, and the ability to close matches under pressure is something every young player must develop. It also does not mean that every Filipino supporter at the U.S. Open came from New York. Some may have traveled from other states, Canada, the Philippines, or other parts of the world. The argument is not that the crowd was exclusively local. The argument is that a critical mass of the audience was already present in the New York region, already connected, and already waiting for a reason to gather. Finally, the match result does not erase the meaning of the day. If Alex won, the moment became a celebration of a breakthrough. If she lost, the historic significance of her appearance remained. The achievement was not only the score, it was the existence of the moment itself. So let's bring this back to Woodside. The 7 train will continue to run on Monday morning. It will run through September, October, and all the years after Alex is no longer 20, no longer unseeded, and no longer new to the world. What August 24th, 2025 did was not create a Filipino-American fan base. It gave that fan base coordinates. It gave millions of people a scheduled hour, a stadium, a television broadcast, and a player who could stand in the middle of all of it. Alex did not build that community through a simple transaction of wins for loyalty. She became visible to a community that had been waiting for someone to see it and to be seen by it. The traveling supporters at tournaments across the season were not merely a career byproduct, they were a diaspora finding a meeting point. The pre-match mobilization for an unseeded player was not irrational. It was decades of demand meeting its first major opportunity. And the crowd that appeared, despite uncertainty, was not confused about tennis. It understood that the match represented something larger than tennis. It represented the room. It represented the first time that a Filipino diaspora could gather around one of its own on one of the biggest stages in American sport. Whatever happened on the scoreboard, that hour was already historic before it began. So now I want to hear from you. Where were you when Alex Eala played her first US Open main draw match? Were you in the stands, on the 7 train, watching from home, or following the match from the Philippines? Had you ever cheered for a Filipino player at a Grand Slam before Alex? If the answer is no, tell us that too. Tell us where you were and who you were watching with. We are building the map in the comments, a map of where this community is standing. Because after Alex Eala's US Open debut, that map will not return to being empty. She has already placed a pin on it, and the rest of us now know exactly where to look. Kabayan. That is the story beneath the score. That is why the train was full. Editorial note. The source script contains time-sensitive statistics, rankings, tournament details, population estimates, and references to reported injuries and media coverage. Verify all figures, dates, opponent names, rankings, and quotations against primary or reputable sources before publication.